Okay, so we're going to pick back up with Campbell's taxonomy of performance. So again, just a reminder, the three key components of this taxonomy, and a taxonomy basically is just, again, a framework or a model for thinking about how to measure, in this case, performance. So as a reminder, job-specific task performance, demonstrated effort, and maintaining personal discipline are key to any job. So no matter what the job is, those three components typically need to be measured. And this is another way to kind of conceptualize, are you capturing enough of performance in your actual criterion? So one way is to use a job analysis to create the ultimate criterion based on the job analysis, which again is only an estimate of that ultimate criteria, and then try to capture as many of those components with what you actually measure for performance in your actual criterion. Campbell's taxonomy is another way to kind of conceptualize at a more broad level what key components of a job needs to be captured by performance. So let's talk about these 8 components. So as I said, the most important one is job-specific task performance or proficiency. So it's the core task central to the job. So basically what Campbell's saying here is that before you start thinking about anything else, have you actually captured the core components of the job? So for a faculty member, that's teaching, service, and research. If you're doing performance, you had better make sure that your actual criterion has some method of measuring those 3 of those. If you're measuring someone that has a very simple job, again, what is the core task of that job? If it's producing X number of units per hour, then you'd better make sure that that's at least one of the things you're measuring if you claim you're going after performance. The next part of this, the next broad category of measures or things we should measure for performance is non-job specific task proficiency. So these are tasks that are not specific to a particular job, but are more of, think of them as competencies that generally are well regarded for in an organization. So if an organization has a culture of being very friendly, this might be a part of, that's a non-job specific task proficiency. People that are open and friendly typically do better, are better received, and are actually thought of as being a better representation of what the company's overall image and goals are. Written and oral communication tasks, so proficiency for writing and speaking. And again, not all jobs are going to require you to be good at writing or oral communication. This is specific to some tasks and some jobs. Demonstrating effort, consistent and persistent in their work effort. So again, all jobs, if there is some core task, that core task requires you to have knowledge, job-specific task proficiency, but also willing to be and motivated to put in the effort to actually do that task. Maintaining personal discipline, so again, the avoidance of negative behaviors. This includes substance abuse, stealing from the company, but it also involves negative behaviors such as being late, being unconscientious or unprofessional in your mannerisms. And again, all jobs require some level of maintaining personal discipline. Facilitating peer and team performance, so managers will have a whole cluster of performance that's related to them facilitating how peers and their teams perform. So helping and supporting their peers and their subordinates, and also job related problems. But this is really, again, it's not necessarily all managers will do this. This is a component of managing, and sometimes it won't even be managers. So if you work in an organization that involves almost all teamwork, then every one of those teams is going to need to have some set of skills that are involved in this and should be measured with performance. Supervision is the direct management and supervising of employees. So this includes feedback, this includes performance appraisal, this includes making organizational decisions to some degree. And finally, management and administration. So all management behaviors outside of supervision. So anything done at a higher level of an organization that is not involving direct interaction with other employees. So this is strategic vision creating, coming up with new ad campaigns, trying to create an organizational culture, marketing the organization to outside. That would all be kind of management and administration. So of these 8, what Campbell suggests is first you need to decide which of the 8 should be measured, depending on the job that you're trying to actually measure, and then how do you actually measure those traits. So again, we were talking about this idea of a multidimensional criteria, and Campbell's taxonomy is an example of a multidimensional criteria. The idea of multiple things that we want to measure to truly get at performance. So performance, without a question, does consist of multiple criteria. But that creates a problem, that if we're accurately measuring performance, what we're coming up with is a whole series of ratings or feedback or developmental information about parts of performance. If we're needing to make decisions, if we're needing to make human resources decisions, we need to have a composite criteria. So ideally, we want to be able to create that composite criteria. And there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can just do equally weighted combinations of the multiple criteria. But that tends to treat performance as a single construct. So when we're looking at equal weighting, it basically means if we had 5 measures of performance, all on a 1 to 5 scale, we would just average them all together and come up with a final score. And this is done in some organizations. What's most likely better to recognize that performance is not a single construct. It's a combination of different constructs, different measures, and some of those measures are more important than others, is the idea of an unequaled weighting. So the criterion dimensions are weighted differently, and these should be based on value judgments, based on organizational goals and research, but also to some degree the purpose of the decision making. So you would probably weight things slightly differently if what you were trying to do is determine who needs training in certain skill areas than how you'd weight it if you were trying to determine who actually gets promoted. And you might weight it also differently depending if the decision you were going to make is who actually is going to be terminated. So if you were actually planning to promote people, you'd probably be very focused on the parts of their job that will also be still being completed or done at a higher level if they get promoted. If you're looking at basically deciding who needs to be removed from an organization because of downsizing or other concerns, then you may be basically focused on only weighting very highly the core task that that job entails. So decisions on how to treat multiple criteria should be based on purpose. So Schmidt and Kaplan in 1971 wrote a really good article on this, and they basically said that you first have to ask simply the question of, are you wanting psychological understanding or decision making with an economic focus? If you're wanting psychological understanding, the multiple criteria should be examined in the light of the predictors and not combined. In other words, if you're doing a 360 evaluation, if you're doing performance management, if your purpose is to find strengths and weaknesses, then you should never even be trying to come up with a composite score. You should be looking at them individually to inform actionable feedback that people can act on through coaching and through performance management. However, if the purpose for performance management or for the performance appraisal and measurement, the criteria, is for decision making with an economic focus, you have to come up with a way to combine criteria into one dimension as an index of economic success. So that's an important factor right there, an index of economic success. So if we're measuring performance broadly, we're probably capturing a fair amount that isn't directly tied to economic success. If we're making decisions, that's what that's saying is that the factors of the measurement of all of performance that are most tied to the organizational goals of making a profit, of making an economic success, those are the ones we need to weight very highly, depending on the decision we make. So most applied psychologists should use weighted composites to make hiring decisions while using the multiple dimensions to understand both the relationships with predictors for determining a selection battery, but also for doing performance management. So here's just a quick example of a weighted criteria, and it's the same criterion dimensions in both cases. So this is, again, a job for an administrative assistant, and we've got some criteria dimensions right down the middle. Punctuality, performance quality, interpersonal performance, leadership behaviors, computer performance, and organizational performance in general. Now, each one of these, let's imagine, is simply being rated by a manager or a supervisor on a 1 to 5 scale. If we were using these for developmental purposes, we wouldn't need weights. We would just look to see what were they doing really well with and what were they doing poorly with. If they were doing poorly in some area, we would think about how do we actually change that then? How do we coach them? How do we provide them more feedback? How do we provide training? However, if we wanted to make a decision, we need to ask, what is the decision that we're making? So if we're looking to see who gets promoted to become a supervisor, so there's 20 job assistants or administrative assistants, and someone's going to actually leave the role of administrative assistant to be promoted internally to become a supervisor of the assistants. At that point, let's take a look at the weights that were chosen. And these are being chosen somewhat arbitrarily, but they're being chosen again based on the economic decision. And this can be done by either the managers in the organization, and sometimes HR administrators or even IO psychologists will be involved in creating these weights. So leadership behaviors in this case is the most highly rated because, again, they're not going to necessarily be doing as much of the actual work of a job administrative assistant. They're going to be taking on a managerial role. Computers are still going to be important. Performance is still important. Interpersonal performance is definitely important. Maybe the quality of their performance just as an indicator of how conscientious they are. And punctuality in this case has been actually reduced. And this might be, if punctuality here is listed as 0, it might be that in this new role, they don't necessarily have to be punching the clock exactly 9 to 5. They may have a more flexible work schedule. So looking at punctuality might not be very useful. So these would be ways to determine who needs to be promoted. Now, if the criterion is shifting, we're looking at performance this time because we have to downsize, and we unfortunately have to fire 2 people. At that point, the quality of their performance is going to be the highest rated, and punctuality, an objective measure, is going to be very important. We're no longer worried about interpersonal performance because, quite honestly, we're worried that might be a biased rating. That might be capturing a little bit of likability, and we don't want to be accused of just firing someone because they're not liked. Leadership behaviors aren't important because that's not really that key to the core job requirements of an administrative assistant. And again, computer performance and organizational performance are factors as well. So you can kind of see how these weights are going to change depending on what kind of decision we're making, and that's what should be done. So we do need to acknowledge an assumption that we're making when trying to measure performance or measure the criteria or criterion that capture performance. And that is that assumption of reliability, that performance is relatively stable. Research has not completely supported this. So dynamic criteria is what is a term we use to discuss the fact that what we're trying to measure is not always stable. So measures that reflect performance levels which change over time is what we call a dynamic criteria. So we also want to be able to try to capture the day-to-day changes in performance. So most of the things we come up with when we're trying to measure performance are things that we're hoping will be relatively stable over time. So for example, attendance. Someone that likely is very conscientious is probably going to be at work on time most of the time, and we're going to see a lot of reliability there. But some kinds of performance will be fairly dynamic. They change from time to time. So it's a problem for IO psychologists because validity of predictors can deteriorate over time. So if what we're capturing is a dynamic criteria, a lot of times our actual measure of it is going to vary over time, and that's going to be harder for us to be able to validate and claim a measure is reliable. Most effective employees during the first 6 months of the job are not always the same as those at the end of the next 6 months. So we generally find that employees overall sometimes have good periods and bad periods in their overall performance. So this has been shown through archival research. So again, archival research is just looking at pre-existing data. Hoffman, Jacobs, and Gurus in 1992 basically looked at the batting averages of baseball players and earned run averages of pitchers over a long period of time. And what they found was that actually a fair amount of players were relatively consistent in their performance, but not all of them. Performance of some players consistently improved over time, others consistently declined over time, and some varied very less without much systematic patterns. In other words, sometimes they had great games and sometimes they had poor games. And the fact that performance is not always going to be stable is an additional challenge in trying to measure it. Now, dynamic criteria has also found that certain conditions, however, that basically when we're looking at how performance can be dynamic, what we're often missing is that various events are probably affecting that performance. So Daesin and Chen in 2004 examined NHL hockey players who had recently become the leaders of their team. So again, they looked at all this archival data, looked at performance based on objective measures of performance in games of hockey players, and they looked at performance for those that were eventually going to be promoted to a captain, how their performance looked prior to that event and afterwards. And they found a relative increase in productivity, an index of points based on goals and assists, as a function of new leadership responsibilities. So basically, this shows that dynamic criteria is a problem, but a lot of times it's probably not that we're capturing just random fluctuations. It's probably those fluctuations are being caused by outside impact or outside factors. So let's just kind of categorize broadly now what kind of performance criteria or measures that we can have. And we're kind of, again, piggybacking over some of the terms we talked about when we were talking about performance appraisal broadly. So objective criteria are often referred to as hard or non-judgmental criteria. It's seen as the cleanest because they do not require judgments. So examples are rate of absenteeism, turnover, so how many people are leaving an organization or a department in a month. So example, if you're wanting to compare 5 departments in an organization, a objective criteria could be whichever particular department is losing the most personnel is probably got the greatest problems. Why are people leaving? That's turnover. Lateness, so number of minutes late. Also, if the job itself involves the actual physical production of something, how many of those items are being produced and what is the quality of those items? Most typical objective criterion is productivity, number of acceptable products produced in a given time period. And it's easy to conceptualize that as an objective criteria if you're actually creating a physical object, like if you're making wallets over an hour. But it can also be looked at as any actual measurable outcome. So in the case of faculty, I'm being measured on performance for research, I'm being measured on performance for teaching, and I'm being measured for research on service. Now, one of the criteria that are measured for research is simply how many publications do I get a year? So how many times do I produce a research article, a physical object, that is actually resulting in a publication? That's a fairly objective criteria. Now, the quality of that research, so how good is that research, that could be a little bit more subjective, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, generally speaking, objective criteria become less and less suitable for more complex jobs, managerial jobs, so generally they're more suitable for non-managerial jobs. Subjective criteria is often known as softer judgmental criteria. It's based on judgments or evaluations of others, typically includes ratings and rankings of employees by other employees, supervisors, coworkers, subordinates. It's an excellent alternative when objective criteria do not exist. So basically, when you're looking at creating an actual criterion from the ultimate criterion, you're going to look at either a taxonomy like Campbell or a job analysis to try to come up with a theoretical cluster of what do you need to measure if you were ideally going to capture the ultimate criterion. Then you're going to determine what can we measure. As you're looking at what can you measure, one of the first questions you want to ask is, are we measuring the core or most important parts of the job? And can they be measured objectively? If so, they should be in there. The next question is, what core or important traits or tasks or behaviors are in that theoretical ultimate criterion that we can't capture with objective measures, but we still want to measure? How can we measure it subjectively? So we also want to categorize that within that actual criterion, the things that we're measuring to get at performance, how many of them are task versus contextual performance? So task performance are specifically work-related activities performed by employees that contribute to the technical core of the organization. So when you think of task performances, what we're really talking about here is what are the key things this job is supposed to produce that actually result in the company making more money. So broadly speaking, in my tasks as a professor, that really is teaching classes and classes that have a lot of students that actually attend. At the end of the day, that's what actually brings money into the university. From the research aspect, it's how many grants do I get? Because again, that's actually bringing money in to the university. So if we're looking at it purely from a profit viewpoint, the university is most interested in how many seats I'm filling in my classes and how much grant money I'm bringing in. Now, a university is a public institute, so it's not, at least in our case, SIUE is a public institute, which means it's not necessarily geared to make profit. It wants to make sure it's bringing in enough money to cover all of its expenses, and that's important, but it also is interested in basically how well are we actually educating people. That is the true organizational goal. So again, with task performance, you could actually measure the number of students that I have in my classes. That's an objective measure. But you're also interested in what is the quality of my education. And teaching evaluations will often ask the students to rate my teaching. That is a subjective measure. Now, contextual performance is activities performed by the employee that help to maintain a broader organizational, social, and psychological environment. So what kind of coworker am I? How likely is it that I'm willing to help out someone that is in need? That again, a lot of those things, being a more collegial person in my organization is going to generally make it to where people are more likely to stay. They're going to like their job more. It's going to increase job satisfaction. It's mainly going to indirectly affect performance in the organization, my own and others. So if we expand these criterions and domains, what we generally find is we've kind of got three broad things. The first and top level is the measures that we want if we can get them, and those are objective task performance. We want to be able to capture task performance with objective measures as much as possible. However, if there are things that we can't measure objectively that are still important towards task performance, we want to also capture those with subjective measures. So subjective task performance. And finally, once we have our objective and subjective measures of task performance, we also want to recognize that we may, depending on the job and the complexity of the job, want to include items that actually measure contextual performance. Providing extra effort, volunteering. Civic virtue is basically just protecting the organization, helping others, organizational loyalty, and also not performing counterproductive behaviors. So contextual behaviors or performance is often referred to as organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCBs. Some people call them pro-social organizational behaviors, or POBs. OCBs are the ones you'll hear the most, and it's the term I most often use. Basically, Borman and Mortavillo in 1997 came up with 5 core dimensions of contextual performance. And again, this is a taxonomy, if you will, a framework or a guideline to think about when we're trying to come up with the way to measure these types of performances. So there's working with extra enthusiasm and effort. So that's going above and beyond expectation. That's being very enthusiastic about your job. That's being very openly satisfied with your work. And that's also putting in extra effort when necessary. Volunteering for things that are not formally a part of the job. So showing up at company picnics, being involved in planning a company party, also volunteering to help out someone else when they're needing help. Helping others within the job, sportsmanship and organizational courtesy. So again, being available to provide your expertise to make sure that others are doing their job well. Meeting deadlines and complying with organizational rules and regulations. So this is kind of conscientiousness. This is, again, going above and beyond to make sure that you're doing things in a way that helps the organization. And finally, supporting and defending the organization. So this is not bad-mouthing your organization when you're amongst friends. This is basically showing support. So for a faculty member at SIUE, this would be wearing SIUE shirts when they were outside, rooting for our teams, and basically, when people ask, saying it's a great university and you should come here, not bad-mouthing it. So task versus conceptual performance, the major distinction here between task performance and conceptual performance is that task activities vary a great deal across jobs. Contextual performance does not. So that's one of the other reasons that contextual performance is something that a lot of organizations are interested in. Going back to job analysis and when we were talking about job analysis, we were basically talking that a job analysis is very task-focused. It's very focused on particular jobs. And likewise, the measurement of task activities are also very directly tied to that specific job and that job analysis. We also talked about the idea of competency models. So these were more broad-based models trying to capture what individual personal traits or outlooks or culture led to people being a better fit for the organization. And those usually map on much more to contextual performance, because contextual performance is usually the same across an entire organization. These are valued values. These are valued behaviors at an organizational level. Task activities are more likely to be formally instituted as a part of a job description and performance appraisal than contextual performance. So generally, task activities are more likely to be measured when we're trying to measure performance, and they're also more likely to be directly listed as important parts of the job. Contextual performance often is left unspoken. Task activities have different antecedents. So basically, when we're trying to predict if someone is good at their task, cognitive ability is often a good predictor, and also just knowledge tests are a good predictor. OCBs are more predicted by personality and conscientiousness. So research on contextual performance, researchers have begun to propose selection instruments to predict employees' likelihood of OCBs. And a lot of times these selection instruments will be drawn off of competency models more than job analyses. A framework proposes that OCBs result in favorable relationships amongst coworkers, which serves as social capital. So basically, the idea here is that if you are doing OCBs, if you're helping other people out, you're creating a network of people that somewhat owe you for the help you've given them, which means that if you come upon a rough part in your job, or you have a task that you're not going to be able to complete on your own, you have people that you kind of can call favors in from. And research has found that this social capital affects organizational performance and effectiveness. The more people are doing OCBs and building social capital with networks of coworkers, generally speaking, we find an increase in overall performance of that organization. OCBs have mainly been identified in U.S. samples, but we've also been starting to see research that applies them to internal or international, is what that should say, context. Belgium is a good example of research, and also research has started to look at OCBs in other cultures, such as in the Middle East and also in the Far East and Asia. The flip side of organizational behavior, the other type of contextual behavior we're worried about, is counterproductive behavior. So again, these are both organizational citizenship behaviors and counterproductive behaviors can be occurring at the same time someone is doing the tasks of their job fine. So someone could be completing the tasks that are involved in the job. So they have the knowledge of the job-specific task proficiencies, they're putting in effort, and they're putting in personal discipline, but on the side, they're either going above and beyond to do well, organizational citizenship behaviors, or they're also doing counterproductive behaviors. Now, a lot of times counterproductive behaviors will also go hand in hand with also failing at the tasks of the job themselves, but I do want to clearly state it is a separate construct. So there are behaviors that somehow harm or detract from an organization. So theft, sabotage, abuse of others, withdrawal behaviors, and withdrawal behaviors can include basically not showing up for work, but also just being disengaged when you're at work. Research has found that counterproductive behaviors are more strongly related to organizational and individual performance than OCBs. So basically, someone that's doing OCBs is kind of having a very small ripple positive effect in an organization. When you have someone doing counterproductive behaviors, it often has a much stronger impact on the organization's performance and that individual's performance. And again, personality variables are much better predictors of contextual performance. Cognitive ability variables are better performance predictors of those task performance. So again, it's personality that generally determines if someone is likely to do counterproductive behaviors. Now, also counterproductive behaviors can often be the result of very low job satisfaction or very high stress. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of this set of lectures. Again, the idea here that we were talking about was different frameworks or different ways to conceptualize how to measure performance in an effort to get our actual criterion, our actual measurements, as close as possible to our ultimate measurement or criterion.